Welcome. Welcome. You are listening to audio from the table. If you'd like to learn more about our community or donate to this ministry, please visit thetabletx.com.
July is our time of rest at the table, and it's really so nice to be able to send Brett and Maggie and Mindy off just into the world for a month, and they can enjoy family time, rest time, recoup, refresh. And while we miss them, a big benefit for us is we get to hear from some amazing guest speakers. Last week we heard from Dr. Aaron Brownbrook talking about the story of Jonah, and this week we get to hear from Charles Kiser, and we'll clap for him in a moment. And it's really a privilege and a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Charles. I got to know him about a year and a half ago through Centerpiece and Sally Gary, who some of you know and love. And he also spent quite a bit of time with our table elder team, which I was a part of, and really gleaned from his coaching, his listening skills, his knowledge, and just heart for God and heart for people. And so I'm going to share a bio that Charles shared with me, which I also appreciated, and I'll add a little bit of my own stuff at the end. But Charles was a pastor in Dallas for 16 years with Storyline Christian Community, a network of house churches he helped to start. He was also a ministry coach for Brett and the Table Elder team for a year and a half before his family decided to become members of the table this summer. Charles and his wife Julie have 3 kids, Ryan, Chloe, and Charlie, and a frenetic Boston Terrier named Gus. Charles is the co-founder of the Healing Collective, a ministry that creates spaces for healing religious trauma and trauma-informing faith leaders. He is also the DFW Regional Area Developer for the Post-Evangelical Collective. And a word that comes to mind when I think about Charles is trustworthy. Trustworthy. And he has some really good and needed stuff that the church should be and needs to be talking about. And Charles does this with such a giftedness and empathy and, again, knowledge and trustworthiness that it's really a gift to have him with us today. And also just a gift to have he and Julie and the kids here among us regularly at the table. And I asked if I could share this. He didn't put it in the bio. He's also written a book. So if you're interested, I've got it on my chair. It's available on Amazon. It is called Trauma-Informed Evangelism, Cultivating Communities of Wounded Healers. So without further ado, please welcome Charles.
Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Good evening, everybody. I am so excited to get to share a message with you all, and I'm super grateful for the invitation, and I'm super grateful for this church. You all have been a safe haven for me and my family as we have transitioned this year from pastoral ministry, and we're excited to get to know all of you. This is kind of an interesting way to meet some of you right now. But so hi, I'm Charles. But we're excited to get to know more of you as we get involved in this community. I asked Brett if he had any topic or theme that he wanted me to explore tonight, and he suggested that I sermonize about spiritual trauma because of my work in that area. As Karen mentioned, I've co-authored a book related to that topic. I'm starting a new ministry related to religious trauma awareness and healing. And so that's some of what we're going to be talking about. And that feels important to share that conversation with Brett so that you don't think that I was super eager to help everybody be really depressed and triggered tonight. It's Brett's fault. I was just doing what Brett, he's not here. He can't defend himself, right? You can take it up with him, right? I'm not eager to do that. And while spiritual trauma is indeed heartbreaking and heavy, I hope to offer some good news, some hope for anyone here who might be carrying the burden of religious trauma, or anyone who loves someone that does. I want to encourage you to take care of yourself during this time. I'm going to share some heavy stories as a way of illuminating the dynamics of religious trauma. And if you find yourself activated by any of what we talk about, please know that I bless you to tune out if you need to focus on your breath, even to take a break if that is what you need to do. Be kind to yourself. Several years ago, I was doing a listening project among my friends in a board gaming group I'd been a part of for a few years. I was interested to learn about what makes this community tick, because it was such a significant source of support and care for the people that were a part of it. And one of my questions was something like, is there anything spiritual or transcendent to you about your experience in this group? My friends knew that I was a pastor. I'd been a part of this group for a long time, and so my question about spirituality wasn't like an evangelism trick or something. Many of them knew me well enough, apparently, to feel like they could answer honestly. Most of my friends are also self-described atheist or agnostic, and so predictably they said something like, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't really have categories for spiritual or transcendent. And then almost to a person, all of them said something to the effect of, but can I tell you about the terrible things that have happened to me in religion or in the church? I didn't have language for it at the time, but I was encountering experiences of spiritual abuse and religious trauma. My friends were, in the words of Jesus, burned out on religion. Really burned out by religion. Not by their own doing, but because they were wounded and traumatized by others in the name of religion or in the name of God. Their experience surfaced my own wounds in the context of religion that had yet to heal. I want to share tonight a couple of those stories as a way of describing religious trauma, and I do so, of course, with their permission and changing their names to protect their privacy and well-being. Chris grew up in a fundamentalist church in West Texas with a very authoritarian pastor. It is the kind of church that had armed guards at the doors and was deeply committed to end times predictions, especially around the year 2000, if you remember Y2K. These predictions just so happened to be only available by the revelation that was received from God to the senior pastor. And this group was so committed to the imminent return of Jesus that they discouraged all of the young married adults in their congregation from having children, because Jesus is coming anytime. Why waste your time? It's a troublesome and risky time to do that. So Trauma happens when we have this disconnect, when those are in our closest relationships, when we feel powerless or out of control, or like something is happening to us that we can't prevent, and there's no one there to see us or know us or help us. Chris, he lost all of his closest relationships. The people who would have been his empathetic witnesses were the ones that cut him off and told him, "We'll never see you again." And so Chris started carrying things in his body, in his nervous system, because of that disconnect, because of that traumatic experience. Another way of understanding trauma is thinking about it like an imprint. Bessel van der Kolk, maybe you've heard of his book, The Body Keeps the Score, talks about trauma as not the thing that happened to us, but the imprint of adverse experiences on our mind, in our brain, in our body. You can see the imprint in Chris's mind and body and brain when he sat in the parking lot and heard worship music, and it activated this sense of panic, this sense of, oh, I need to get out of here, because this is reminding me of this past terror that will I revisit it again if I go into this building, into this place of worship. So if religious trauma is also trauma, then religious trauma is the imprint of adverse religious experiences upon our mind and body and brain. Teresa had 2 experiences of spiritual abuse and trauma in her youth that led her to leave the church. The first was when a good friend died by suicide after being sexually abused by a Catholic priest in her parish and in their school. The church tried to cover it up. And the second was when her college roommate almost died by suicide, and when expelled from her private Christian university, the administration said, we don't want those kinds of students here. And Teresa heard that and witnessed that and thought, I am done with this. I will never again darken the door of a church building or a religious institution unless I have to go to my best friend's wedding or something. I'm done. Teresa loved Jesus. She loved the way that Jesus looked out for the outsider and for the lost and for the outcast. And she didn't leave the church because the church was too much like those things. She left the church because the church wasn't practicing the very things that she loved about Jesus. But the depth of those experiences, the depth of the harm there, caused her faith to be collapsed in and devastated. Not only did she lose her connection to church, she started to question if God really was who God was because of these experiences in church. The trauma devastated her faith too. Teresa's story teaches us a little bit about spiritual abuse. Abuse, according to the American Psychological Association, is interactions in which one person, or I would add group, a person or a group behaves in a cruel, violent, demeaning, or invasive manner toward another person. There's usually an imbalance of power in abuse, where one person or group that has more power uses that power to harm a person or group that has less power. That power difference is what creates the conditions for abuse to occur. So, spiritual abuse, according to Dr. Cindy Matthews, is any abuse that occurs in the name of religion or the deity of that religion. So, spiritual abuse overlaps with all different forms of abuse, with physical, emotional, sexual, verbal, psychological, all the types of abuse you can imagine. Spiritual abuse can come through any of those avenues. What makes spiritual abuse distinct is when it happens in a religious context, when it's motivated by the Bible, when it's done by a spiritual leader, when it's connected to a religious context, because it adds this layer of, not only is this person or this group doing this thing to me, is God doing this to me too? That's the spiritual dynamic there. Anytime a spiritual leader is abusive towards someone else, it is always simultaneously spiritual abuse by virtue of their spiritual role and vocation. This story of Teresa is also a good example of secondary trauma. because you might notice that she was not the direct recipient of the abuse or the harm in either case. She was the one who witnessed it. She loved the people who were harmed. Secondary trauma is the trauma that we experience when we witness others being harmed or abused. And it can have just as substantial an impact. It can get lodged in our nervous systems just as deeply as the kind of trauma we experience when we experience firsthand the adverse experiences ourselves. Henry grew up in the Midwest in what he describes as a Fox News evangelical church. His dad was the pastor for the church, and Henry realized very early on that he was gay, and when he shared that with his parents, they told him to keep it a secret, because if the church knew, it would threaten his dad's job. If he lost his job, would they have to sell their house? Would they have to move somewhere? Would he be able to get another job as a pastor? And this is a preteen who's having to carry the weight not only of figuring out his own sexuality, but also now suddenly the financial stability and well-being of his whole family because of the religious context that he's in. And the fruit of that for Henry was all kinds of shame. All kinds of shame about who he was. His parents helped Henry to join a ministry focused on conversion or reparative therapy, to repair someone's sexuality or convert them from gay to straight. Henry was part of this ministry for almost 15 years, and it didn't work. In fact, some of the leaders of this very well-known ministry told him at the end of his experiences, we never really believed that it would. We've never really thought that someone's sexual orientation could change. And so added on top of the shame that Henry felt was a sense of betrayal and deceit, that he'd been lied to by these people he had trusted himself to. Most heartbreaking of all is that Henry hated himself. He ended up leaving church in adulthood because the shame and the self-loathing were unbearable. And he did it out of self-preservation, totally understandably. Henry's story shows us the way that it's not just interactions between people or groups and people that can be a source of abuse and trauma. It's also rooted in the way that we think and see the world, the way that our imagination takes root in the institutions and organizations that we're part of. Toxic theology, toxic ways of understanding God and ourselves can be sources of real deep harm and trauma. Diseased theological imagination. You can also see in Henry's story this dynamic of complex trauma, like the picture that you saw of the faucet with the drip, drip, drip. Sometimes trauma isn't just a big traumatic event, it's a series of experiences over time that cumulatively multiply, like compound interest, multiply this pain in your body and your life. Like the drips of a faucet on a rock over time that carve a groove out of that rock and make a permanent impact. That's the nature of complex trauma in a toxic system or culture over time. Whew. Perhaps you can identify with one or more of these stories. Maybe something like this has happened to you or to someone you love. Maybe you've been treated poorly by the church or Christians in the past. Maybe you carry the pain of spiritual abuse and trauma. And if that's true, I'm so sorry. I wish that had never happened. And that was not your fault. Telling these stories, these are loved ones of mine, it always kind of riles up my nervous system. And maybe some of you are there too. So I just want to take a quick regulation break and invite you to co-regulate with me our nervous systems if you need that. and just do some deep breathing with me. Just a few breaths. As if you want to breathe in grace and compassion and kindness, and breathe out pain, stress, and grief. Breathe in, breathe out. I'll let you breathe for a minute. Spiritual abuse and religious trauma is not a new phenomenon. And we can see it in the backdrop of Jesus' words in Matthew 11. Several scholars believe that when Jesus is referring to those who are worn out and burned out by religion, those who are weary and heavy burdened or heavy laden in the versions we might be more familiar with, that the source of exhaustion and stress is the demands of the religious leaders of the day. In another text, Jesus accuses the Pharisees of tying up heavy loads and putting them on people's shoulders. Literally, heavy burdening people. At least part of what Jesus is offering relief from here is spiritual abuse and trauma that was caused by religious leaders and religious systems. Matthew 11:28 could just as easily read, "Are you tired, worn out, traumatized by religion?" These same religious leaders afflicted Jesus with nearly every conceivable form of abuse in the events that culminated in his crucifixion. Verbal abuse, he was mocked and ridiculed. Physical abuse, he was whipped and beaten. Emotional and psychological abuse, all the gaslighting from the religious leaders that sought to condemn Jesus. Betrayal trauma, his closest male disciples. Female disciples were great. Male disciples betrayed Jesus. Even sexual abuse, because Jesus was hanging naked from the cross. This is like a voyeuristic kind of torture that Jesus experiences. But all of these forms of abuse were simultaneously expressions of spiritual abuse, because they never would have happened had it not been instigated out of the fear and diseased imagination, the toxic theology of the religious leaders who felt threatened by Jesus. They instigated Jesus' crucifixion in the name of religion and in the name of God. So, that means that Jesus is a victim of spiritual abuse. Jesus is a survivor of religious trauma. And contrary to popular theological imagination, God is not the source of that spiritual abuse and religious trauma. God is not the abuser in chief on the cross. Violence in all its forms is contrary to God's nature. Jesus, rather, is part of the divine community with mother and spirit. And rather than perpetrate violence, they suffer together the spiritual abuse and the religious trauma of the cross. They take this abuse and trauma up into their shared life. They experience its pain and death, and they transform it into new life and wholeness. Earlier, we defined trauma as what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. Healing, then, comes through the presence of an empathetic witness, someone who comes alongside of us and sees our wounds, who hears our story and grieves it and laments with us and says, "I'm so sorry. That should never have happened. That was not your fault." What if this is one of the meanings of the cross? That through the cross, Jesus is an empathetic witness to our pain. Jesus knows what it's like. Jesus suffers with us. Jesus is betrayed with us. Jesus up from the burdens of trauma. We're liberated to reconnect with others as empathetic witnesses to their pain. In other translations of Matthew 11, Jesus refers to his yoke. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. I found it so. You might know that song. It's old. I'm old. It's old. The yoke refers to a wooden crosspiece that's fastened over the necks of two animals, and it's attached to a plow or a cart that they would then pull. The First Nations version of Matthew 11:30 captures the sense of the yoke in its language, where Jesus says, "Walk side by side with me, and I'll share your heavy load and make it light." In the scriptures, the yoke is often a metaphor for oppression. For example, in Isaiah, God says, "Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke?" Wisdom teachers and rabbis would also use this term yoke to describe their relationship with their disciples, that the way that they were walking with them to impart their wisdom to them. So, Jesus is saying, I'm liberating you from the yoke of oppression you've been under. I'm freeing you up from the bonds of religious abuse and trauma. I'm inviting you to come under my yoke, a yoke not of oppression, but of healing, a yoke of compassion, gentleness, and kindness, a yoke where Jesus does the heavy lifting. And that's not to say that there is a magical solution, a magical spiritual solution to healing from religious trauma. We've got to do the body work where we process the pain of trauma that's lodged in our nervous systems, that has to be dislodged and discharged from our bodies. We also need supportive relationships, like our therapists, our pastors, close friends who can enter in with us as empathetic witnesses and grieve those harmful experiences with us. But we also need spiritual connection, which, when it comes to religious trauma, is all the more important and all the more difficult to find, because those past sources of spiritual connection became sources of pain for many of us. Jesus is saying, are you burned out by religion? Come to me. I want to walk with you. I want to lift your burdens. I want to heal your wounds. How will we respond? Will we receive Jesus' empathetic witness of our pain? Will we receive Jesus' liberation, his yoke of healing, and let him do the heavy lifting for us? You know what? If you're not sure, that's okay. If it sounds great, but you've had lots of pain and bad experiences that make it hard to trust again, that's totally understandable. Jesus is gentle and humble. He won't force you to come, but he'll be there for you if you ever want to.